Hello everybody, my name's Kurt Papstein and I'm here to share with you some of my sculpting techniques that I use when I'm using anatomy reference such as this. So you can see here, while I'm working inside of a program like ZBrush, which is a digital sculpting tool, this really applies to any type of sculpting that you're doing. And a lot of this too translates into drawing and painting as well, so it's not just limited to the tools that I'm talking about here. But what you can see is I'm starting with very, very primitive shapes, which is very much like an armature. So dealing with spheres and cylinders to span like the major large shapes, while slowly layering in some of the form, tumbling the model around, and also tumbling my reference around as well so that I can see it from all angles. And when dealing with sculpture, it's really important to look at it from all angles and not get fixated on just one view, whether that be front, profile, or back. You really want to look at it from all of the in-between shots as well, because that's what's really going to show if the form is correct. Also using materials or lighting in your scenario, whether it be digital or traditional, to showcase those features. So some of the brushes I'm using here it's really irrelevant which brushes I'm using, it's more important how I'm using them. So you can see that I'm using a lot of brushes that build the form or inflate the form upward, and I use another tool to really carve in contour-like shapes and cuts so that I give myself a visual guide. That way I'm blending some of my more familiar art techniques like with sketching. So it's very, very much like sketching in clay, and then those are my guides for where forms come together. So where two muscles meet, I will create a cut and then balloon that shape outward with my other sculpting brushes. So when it comes to the form and building up these forms, there's a couple things you need to really keep in mind. You need to keep in mind the A and B point in the form. So like when we're talking about an individual muscle, point A is the origin point and point B is the secondary origin point, because a muscle could go in two directions, right? So it doesn't necessarily have a start and an end, like that's kind of relative. What's more important is where the muscle is connecting. That's the point A and point B connection. When you think about where it's connecting to, where it's pulling from and stretching, those two anchor points are the hard points. Then when you are constructing the muscle, you really think of the muscle as almost a water balloon. It's a very large mass that is very flexible. And when you think of it like a water balloon, then another really important factor comes into play, which is gravity. So you have the bones of the structure. That's the skeleton, you know, it's holding everything together. It's the core of the entire piece. And then you have all of these water balloons that are connected together, that are laced together, wrapping around each other, overlapping, colliding, and those shapes are what are trying to sag. So another really good analogy for dealing with all this form is if you think about, when you're looking at your reference, think about it melting when you're constructing this stuff. It's melting a little bit as you're working on it, and that will help you really get a sense of the gravity and the weight, and that's what's going to take your sculpt to that next level. That's what's going to make it that much better. It's going to be that level of realism and life that you breathe into it, and there's a lot of factors that go into what makes it more living and more believable. It's that soul of the piece that you're really trying to capture in it. Now, a lot of artists, especially in my field dealing with video games and movies, feel that the animator is what's going to be breathing the life into it. And while that is very, very true, and I don't disagree with that statement, I do think that it is the sculptor's job as well to breathe that life into it. And gravity and weight has a lot to do with it. You look at something that's standing very rigid and stiff, and it looks awkward and uncomfortable. It doesn't look believable or convincing. But as soon as it starts to relax a little bit, it lets its shoulders down, you see some of the muscles relax, everything kind of has a pull to it with gravity, right? Everything kind of pulls down. Then it becomes so much more believable. And identifiable and you can relate to it. So while I'm using this reference, I'm looking at all the landmarks, and the landmarks are what is going to help me set up like the whole blueprint. So I'm working as a translator right now. I'm translating between what I'm seeing on my desk to what I'm doing on the computer screen. And again, if you're working traditionally with real clay, or you're working digitally like I am, or you're sketching, really doesn't matter what it is you're doing. The point is, you are the translator, and you need to coordinate with your brain and with your hand to translate that down onto your medium, or into your medium. So you can see what I'm doing here is I'm looking for those landmarks, right? Every little piece that I'm sculpting here, I'm looking for the really big shapes. And that's really, really important. Deal with the big shapes first. So you can think of the shapes as major, medium, and minor. The major shapes would be your silhouette or your landmarks, right? All the bony points, the point A and the point B destinations for your muscles. Get those laid in, and then you can fill in the gaps in between. So that usually ends up meaning that I'm working on the joints first. So I'll go from shoulder to elbow to wrist. I'll detail those out and get the forms feeling pretty natural. Or I'll go from the collarbone to the bottom of the rib cage to the top of the pelvis if I'm dealing with the torso. And I fill in those shapes in between. That way you have your destination set, and then all you have to do is really enjoy the journey in between. So while you're working, deal with the major shapes, those big shapes. Then you have the medium shapes. The medium shapes are the muscle groups that make up the major shapes. You know, you can look at the torso from straight on and you see its silhouette. That's the major. And then the medium is the pectoral muscles, the abdominal muscles, all the shapes within it. And then you have lastly your minor shapes. Those are the little details, like either it be muscle tissue, fat deposits, things that are happening on the surface or between some of the major muscle groups, or perhaps the smaller muscle groups that make up the medium-shaped muscle groups. You know, there's a lot of muscles that make up the abdominal muscles. There's also more than one muscle that makes up the pectorals. There's multiple muscles, and same with the delts. So you can spend more time and slowly work your way in. So you stay pretty far away, keep a distance from your sculpt so you can deal with these big shapes. And then using your reference, you can begin to focus on the smaller things and just look at one thing at a time. And then it's a matter of just bringing it all together as you go. So that's my technique when I'm doing anatomy studies. I deal with the big shapes first, and then I work my way into the smaller shapes. Don't get lost dealing with the details. It's really important to stay away from that. So what I'm doing here in the second half of my anatomy studies is I'm taking these different pieces that I've made and I've combined them together. And ZBrush gives me a lot of freedom and control over all these different pieces. So I'm able to move, duplicate, cut and paste, and create something completely new out of the somewhat realistic studies that I've done off of this reference piece. So while I still have my model, my reference anatomy model with me, I'm able to look at it and bring that realism and that believability and true life reference into something that I'm making up from scratch. So, well, somewhat from scratch. There's a lot of already believable anatomy going on. It's just a matter of playing with these shapes that I've distorted to make them feel real. And that's how you get something that could be just so far out there in design and unnatural. And you make it real. You make it more believable. You make people buy it. You know, you really want your audience to believe that this is something that could live and exist. So in order to do that, you need to bring real life material into this piece. So since I have my major and medium shapes figured out for the most part, thanks to my earlier anatomy references that I've been doing in the studies, I'm able to look closer at my sculpt and able to look closer at my reference and put some of those finer details into this piece and explore some of the shapes. So while I'm making some sort of monstrous alien-like creature, it's still an anatomy study, and that's something that I think a lot of people overlook or feel is left out when they're doing creature studies, especially like alien studies. I see a lot of people feel and say that it's easier to do than other things. While it does give you more creative freedom to experiment, I don't believe that it is any easier. You still need to have a very good understanding of anatomy, and especially human anatomy. And that's what's going to separate your work from everybody else's. You're going to have that realism, you're going to have that believability, and anatomy to yours that will make it more convincing and more appealing than others. So a lot of people kind of just run with it without a lot of understanding of anatomy, and I think that this reference tool is really going to help a lot of people understand, you know, the way that the human body works, and be able to see the similarities between this and other creatures in nature. And when you have that realization of all the similarities, the rules of nature and anatomy and how it works, it's a very well designed and beautiful machine. And once you have a good understanding of it, then you can start to be really creative. I mean, there's nothing really holding anyone back as far as their creativity. But like I was saying, to make it that much more believable and enjoyable for the audience and more unique, or filled with so much more life as opposed to just an idea, it goes from being just an idea to something that is very well conceived and realistic. So you can see with this character, I've added some hands. Again, I'm using the reference, but I'm not following the same pose. And I think that's true for a lot of it. For the arms as well, you see like the position of the arms have changed, but I know how the anatomy is working, and I've seen how it's working on my reference, that I'm able to explore some different poses. So when it comes to the hands, it's very, very simple. It's very much the same process of starting with my major shapes. So starting with a sphere for the palm of the hand and flattening that out. You can even start with a cube as well, just to get those nice corners to the hand, and then cylinders for the digits. And wherever there's a knuckle or a joint, I use a sphere. And then it's just a matter of polishing all that together and sculpting it all out. But you can see by using those primitives, I'm giving myself very clear landmarks to build off of and sculpt around. So that's one of the major benefits of using tools like this. And of course, if you're using digital, you know, there's a lot of ways that you can go about doing this. And then if you're using traditional clay as your medium, then you have all the freedom in the world to just add those pieces by hand. So you can see I'm going through, now that I have a lot of the anatomy really figured out, it's a matter of building on top of the muscle that I've defined so well, and or you know, in detail, like it, because when you look at the reference, you have like a very defined structure. It's someone who has a very little body fat to them. So that's another level of realism that I'm going to be trying to add here, is the body fat. So what that means is you really have less muscle definition, but I wanted everything that I do to have a lot of realism to it and be convincing. So I needed to really figure the form out, sculpt through it, you know, put those water balloons of muscles in there and pack them in nicely, have them well defined, so that I know exactly where I need to add all the details and everything, and just how the structure is going to work. So that when I add layers of fat and skin on top of that with my clay brushes, and just really smooth some of this stuff out and inflate things and let gravity do its work and pull this stuff down naturally, it's that much more convincing because it has that form underneath. It has that foundation work underneath it that is so much more convincing. Having a good foundation underneath is really the key to making this believable. You can fake it. You can absolutely fake it and do your best to graphically represent some of these shapes, but as soon as you really take the time to develop a better understanding of how these forms are working together in this complete and well thought out machine, which we call anatomy, the better and stronger your work is going to be. So by just doing these studies, it's been quite a while for myself since I've done a study like this, and there were many things, little things that I noticed that have either been forgotten or perhaps I never knew in the first place. So doing these kinds of studies with this type of reference, it's very much like doing regular exercise. It's like cardio for your brain. It's really it's mental challenge in this exercise to stay on top of it. You know, like all of your muscles, you need to exercise them in order to keep them in shape, and your brain is no different. If you really think of it like a giant muscle that needs its exercise, then these studies are very important. So I encourage things like life drawing to most of my students. It's something that I think is very necessary. But a lot of times what you don't get in your life drawing is these more scientific studies. You know, it's almost like these in-depth analytical breakdowns of the human body. And that's something that you don't necessarily get with life drawing. You get hundreds of other things. Like there's an infinite amount of things you can take away from life drawing. And it really depends on where you are as an artist and as a person. You're going to learn something by going through life drawing and studying that. You know, anything from lighting to form to balance to gesture to just, you know, a plethora of things. But when you really sit down with something like this and say, okay, I'm going to figure this out. I'm tired of not fully knowing or faking it. I'm going to sit down with confidence, and every brushstroke I make or piece of clay that I add and define is going to mean something. So, you know, it removes the symptom that I see with a lot of students or a lot of people starting out with art, and they're drawing a character and they get to the hands and they're like, oh, I don't know how to draw the hands. I know, I'll put them in their pockets, or I'll hide it behind the character's back. You know, it prevents you from hiding. You really can't hide. You have to go through and you really need to study it and compare where your piece is at to what the reference is and what you're looking at. So this was one of those pieces that really forced me to spend a little bit more time on each individual part. You know, I didn't spend much time on the design. The design is fairly simple. It's just there's some redundancy with the arms. I wanted to give him two pairs of arms so I could really explore and have a better understanding, because I know as an artist, one of my weaker points is definitely the arms. But after much practice, they've been getting a lot better, and I'm happy to say that they are improving. But you need that practice, and everybody does. Everybody needs the practice, and you know, as soon as you brush up on something and make something look nicer by studying and looking at this stuff, you're going to notice something else that could be improved. Because as soon as you break through those milestones and you breach past a point that you've been at for so long, you see how much better you can get, and then you look at some of your older work and areas of and your knowledge of anatomy that could use work and be brought up to that same level. So it's a never-ending journey of education and study, and that's one of the big appeals for me when it comes to this art, is that it's never-ending. You know, it's an endless journey in design and study and understanding, and because of that, you know, you're really never going to get bored. You know, there's always something to do and something to learn. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope that I've explained enough on how I build up forms and I think gravity is one of the biggest things that breathes life into this. Gravity, weight, that's how you're going to really portray the mass well. And I hope it was clear and enjoyable to see just my overall process and how I do studies and piece them together to create a new and different creature.